The morning of October 23, 2077, began like any other in the comfortable suburban home of Sanctuary Hills. Sunlight streamed through the windows as a veteran of the Anchorage campaign prepared for what seemed like an ordinary day. The house was warm with the sounds of family life, a spouse getting ready, a baby cooing softly in his crib, the friendly robot Codsworth humming along to his duties. There was talk of a veterans' hall meeting, mundane concerns about household matters, and the gentle rhythm of domestic tranquility that people had known for generations. But normalcy was a fragile illusion in the year 2077. The world had been teetering on the brink of nuclear annihilation for years, locked in a bitter conflict between the United States and China over the last remaining oil reserves on Earth. The resource wars had consumed nations. The European Commonwealth had dissolved into bickering countries fighting over resources, and the Middle East had been reduced to a radioactive crater. The United States had annexed Canada, developed power armor for its troops, and created a culture of patriotic fervor mixed with paranoid fear. Companies like Vault-Tec sold survival to those who could afford it, promising safety in underground bunkers when the inevitable finally arrived. That morning, as the family went about their routine, a representative from Vault-Tec appeared at the door. Professional and insistent, the salesperson explained the benefits of Vault registration, the proximity of Vault 111 just outside Sanctuary Hills, and the importance of securing one's family in these uncertain times. The paperwork was filled out quickly: names, occupations, basic information. The Vault representative assured them they were now guaranteed entry should the unthinkable occur. It seemed like just another precaution, insurance against a disaster that might never come. Within hours, everything changed. The television broadcast interrupted its regular programming with an emergency alert. The warning was stark and terrifying. Nuclear detonations had been detected. This was not a drill. Citizens were instructed to evacuate to their nearest designated vault immediately. The calm of the morning shattered into chaos and terror as the reality of nuclear war crashed down upon the world. The family ran. There was no time to pack, no time to plan, barely time to think. They grabbed their infant son and fled their home, joining neighbors in a desperate sprint toward the vault entrance carved into the hillside beyond Sanctuary. The sky was already wrong, the light taking on a sickly quality as the first warnings of approaching warheads screamed across the radio frequencies. Behind them, Codsworth called out, unable to follow, programmed to maintain the house but incapable of entering the vault. His cheerful voice faded as they ran, the last connection to the life they were leaving behind. At the vault entrance, Vault-Tec personnel checked names against lists with bureaucratic efficiency even as the world ended around them. Armed soldiers maintained order as panicked neighbors discovered they weren't on the list, their pleas falling on deaf ears as security pushed them back. Only those pre-registered were allowed passage. The family descended on the platform elevator, dropping down into the earth as others were left behind on the surface, their faces frozen in horror as they realized they would face the nuclear fire unprotected. They descended into the mountain, the platform carrying them away from the sunlight for what they thought would be temporary refuge. When they finally reached the bottom and the vault door sealed behind them with a thunderous finality, there was a moment of relief. They had made it. They were safe. The vault staff welcomed them with practiced professionalism, directing them to the residential area, explaining that they would need to undergo decontamination procedures. It all seemed reasonable, necessary even. The decontamination pods looked like sophisticated equipment, sleek chambers designed to remove radioactive particles. The vault staff explained the process calmly. Enter the pods, undergo the cleaning procedure, and then they would be directed to their living quarters to wait out the danger above. Exhausted from fear and the desperate run to the vault, the family complied. Parents and child were separated into individual pods, the infant secured in a specialized chamber. The doors closed with a hiss of pressurizing seals. That's when the cold began. Not the gentle cool of air conditioning, but a brutal, penetrating cold that burned and froze simultaneously. Frost formed instantly on the interior of the pod, ice crystals spreading across the glass. This wasn't decontamination. This was cryogenic freezing. The realization came too late, the cold already numbing thoughts and slowing reactions. Through the frosting glass, the last sight before unconsciousness was vault staff in protective gear, monitoring readouts with clinical detachment. Vault 111 wasn't a shelter, it was a freezer, its residents unwilling test subjects in a cryogenic preservation experiment. Time stopped in the pods. Consciousness faded into the dreamless void of frozen suspension. Outside the pods, the world above burned and died. The nuclear exchange lasted only hours, but those hours reshaped the planet. Major cities evaporated in atomic fire. Millions died instantly in the blasts, vaporized or consumed by thermal radiation. Millions more died in the days and weeks that followed, as radiation sickness, starvation, and the collapse of civilization claimed the survivors. The United States ceased to exist as a nation. China fell silent. The entire world became a graveyard, poisoned and broken. The years passed unnoticed in the frozen darkness of the pods. 1 year became 10, 10 became 50, 50 became a century. Above ground, the ruins of the old world became overgrown with strange new vegetation, mutated by radiation into twisted forms. Animals evolved into monsters, radroaches the size of dogs, mole rats with multiple heads, mosquitoes that grew to terrifying proportions. Some humans survived in isolated pockets, adapting to the harsh new reality, their descendants becoming something changed by the constant radiation exposure. Inside Vault 111, the pods continued their function, keeping their occupants in perfect preservation. The vault itself operated on automated systems, its experiment continuing even as the staff who initiated it likely died in the chaos above or abandoned the facility. For decades upon decades, the frozen residents remained in their dreamless sleep, unaware that the world they knew had become something alien and hostile. Then, after an unknown span of time in the dark, something changed. Systems activated. The pods began emergency revival protocols. Through the frosting glass, blurred figures moved in the vault. The sound of other pods opening, the hiss of seals breaking. Consciousness began to return, sluggish and confused, to the frozen occupant. Through the ice-covered window of the pod, shapes moved. Voices spoke, harsh and urgent, giving orders. The cryopod directly across the chamber opened with a burst of cold vapor. Inside was the spouse, reviving from their own frozen sleep, confused and disoriented. A figure approached them, dressed in strange attire, wearing a breathing apparatus. The stranger spoke. "This is it. This is the one." Another voice asked about the infant. "Take it. Leave the rest." Horror flooded through the partially thawed consciousness in the sealed pod. The watcher could see, but not move, frozen muscles refusing commands. The stranger approached the spouse's pod. There was a struggle, a gunshot that echoed through the vault chamber. The spouse fell, blood spreading in crimson contrast against the frost. The infant was taken from their pod, crying, and the strangers departed with their prize, leaving death in their wake. The pods reactivated, the freeze returned, forcing consciousness back into the void. But this time it was different. This time, there were memories of what had been witnessed. The murder of a spouse, the kidnapping of a son. Those images became frozen into the mind, preserved like flies in amber, waiting through more years of suspended animation. When the pod finally opened again, it was different. Emergency systems had failed. The cryogenic suspension ended not by design, but by malfunction. The pod door hissed open, and its occupant stumbled out into the vault, muscles atrophied from centuries of disuse, mind reeling from confusion and grief and the slow return of full consciousness. The other pods remained sealed, their occupants still frozen, or perhaps dead from system failures. The vault was silent except for the hum of failing machinery. The sole survivor of Vault 111 stood on trembling legs and tried to make sense of the impossible. How long had passed? Where were the strangers who had killed and kidnapped? Where was Sean, the infant son taken from his pod? The questions multiplied, but the vault offered no answers. Only the cold metal corridors and the eerie emptiness of a place long abandoned by its creators. Moving through the vault on unsteady legs, the survivor found a Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computer that had become standard equipment for vault dwellers. Further exploration revealed the horrible truth in terminal entries and scattered evidence. Vault 111 had been a suspended animation experiment. The residents were never meant to be saved. They were meant to be studied. The staff had monitored them for some time before abandoning the vault, leaving the pods running on automated systems. The entries were dated. The survivor read the numbers with incomprehension, turning to horror. It was no longer 2077. Over 200 years had passed, 2 centuries. Everyone they had known was dead. The world they remembered was gone. Their spouse murdered, their son kidnapped into an incomprehensible future. The weight of it should have been crushing, but the human mind is remarkably resilient in the face of the impossible. Shock gives way to numbness, numbness to determination. There was only one thought that mattered now: find Sean. Whatever world existed beyond the vault door, whatever had happened in the centuries of sleep, the child needed to be found. The survivor made their way to the vault entrance, past the skeletal remains of vault staff who had died at their posts or in the corridors during some long-ago crisis. The massive gear-shaped door of Vault 111 groaned as it opened for the first time in centuries, revealing the tunnel leading back to the surface. The elevator platform had long since failed, so the journey meant climbing worn stairs, each step taking the survivor closer to a world they couldn't begin to imagine. Emerging from the vault entrance felt like being born into a nightmare. The landscape was wrong. Where Sanctuary Hills had been a pristine suburb with manicured lawns and white picket fences, now there was only ruin. Houses stood as hollow shells, their walls crumbling, their roofs collapsed, vegetation growing wild through broken foundations. The sky was a sickly yellow-green, radiation storms visible on the horizon. The air tasted strange, metallic, and dry. The survivor walked down the hill toward what had been home, each step revealing more devastation. The neighborhood was a graveyard of the old world. Cars rusted on the streets, their atomic engines long since dead. Skeletons lay scattered, some still wearing the tattered remains of clothing from that last terrible day. Radiation signs warned of contamination. Strange insects buzzed past, mutated into forms that shouldn't exist. At the house where the survivor had lived that morning 2 centuries ago, Codsworth still functioned. The Mr. Handy robot was weathered, his chassis showing centuries of wear, but his personality matrix remained intact. His greeting was cheerful and confused. speaking as though the family had only been gone for an extended vacation. When he learned the truth, or as much of it as the survivor could explain, his robotic voice took on a tone of distress. He had waited for 200 years, maintaining the property as best he could, hoping for the family's return. Codsworth explained what little he knew of the world. The bombs had fallen just as the family descended into the vault. The neighborhood had been destroyed. He had survived by sheer luck and his robot durability, waiting faithfully. He spoke of raiders, of monsters, of settlements of survivors trying to scratch out existence in the ruins. The Commonwealth, as the former Massachusetts was now known, was a dangerous wasteland filled with threats. But he also spoke of Diamond City, a large settlement built in the ruins of Fenway Park, where people had rebuilt something resembling civilization. If the survivor wanted to find their son, that's where they should start looking for information. The survivor armed themselves with whatever could be salvaged from the ruins: a pistol found in a safe, some worn clothing that offered protection, supplies scavenged from skeletal remains. Codsworth insisted on accompanying them, his loyalty transcending the centuries. Together, they prepared to leave Sanctuary Hills and venture into the Commonwealth, searching for answers in a world neither of them could truly understand. The first steps beyond the neighborhood revealed the true horror of the post-apocalyptic world. A rad roach the size of a large dog attacked from the ruins, forcing a desperate fight. The creature was resilient, its chitinous shell protecting it from the first shots, its mandibles snapping with enough force to tear flesh. It was just the first of countless monsters that now infested the world. Further down the road, a group of raiders, humans twisted by the wasteland into murderous bandits, had made camp at a nearby Red Rocket truck stop. They attacked on sight, forcing another violent encounter. This was the new reality. Kill or be killed, trust no one, scavenge everything. The survivor adapted out of necessity, each encounter teaching harsh lessons about survival in the wasteland. The walk to the nearby town of Concord revealed more ruins, more radiation, more evidence of just how thoroughly the old world had been destroyed. Ghouls, humans who had been transformed by radiation into rotting but immortal creatures, shambled through the ruins, some mindless and feral, attacking anything that moved. In Concord, the survivor encountered Preston Garvey and a small group of settlers taking refuge in the Museum of Freedom, besieged by raiders and a deathclaw, a horrifying creature that looked like a nightmarish cross between a lizard and a monster from fevered imagination. The rescue effort required finding a set of power armor from the crashed vertibird on the roof and a minigun, then engaging in a desperate battle against overwhelming odds. The Deathclaw was a revelation of just how dangerous the wasteland had become. Fast, strong, nearly unstoppable. Victory came at high cost, with ammunition expended and resources depleted. Preston Garvey proved to be a member of the Minutemen, a faction dedicated to protecting settlements throughout the Commonwealth. He spoke of the organization's collapse, of settlements abandoned and people scattered. But he still believed in the cause, and he saw in the survivor someone who could help rebuild. Preston also provided crucial information. Diamond City was indeed the place to go for answers. It was the largest settlement in the Commonwealth, and if anyone knew about the mysterious kidnappers from the vault, it would be someone there. The search for answers. The journey to Diamond City took the survivor through the heart of the Commonwealth wasteland, revealing the full scope of devastation and transformation. The landscape was a haunting mixture of recognizable landmarks made alien by 2 centuries of decay, and the strange new life that had emerged from the nuclear ashes. Routes that had once been highways were now treacherous paths between collapsed overpasses and rusted vehicle graveyards. Towns that had once bustled with life were now silent ruins, prowled by feral ghouls and super mutants, massive, violent humanoids created through a horrifying process of forced mutation. Each step of the journey was an education in the New World Order. The survivor learned to recognize the warning signs of radiation, to navigate around areas where the fallout remained deadly, even after 2 centuries. Settlement after settlement appeared in the distance, small communities built from salvaged materials, their inhabitants eking out survival through farming mutated crops and defending against constant threats. Some welcomed travelers, desperate for news and trade. Others fired warning shots, too paranoid from years of betrayals to risk contact with strangers. The survivor also began to understand the complex web of factions that now controlled the Commonwealth. The Minutemen that Preston represented were only one group. There were raiders operating in organized gangs, claiming territories and extorting settlements. Gunners, mercenaries with military structure and equipment, hired themselves out to the highest bidder and killed anyone who stood in their way. The children of Adam worshipped radiation itself as divine, making their homes in the most contaminated zones and viewing the bombs as instruments of holy purpose. And there were darker rumors of something called the Institute, whispered about in frightened tones, blamed for disappearances and strange occurrences. Diamond City, when it finally came into view, was like finding a piece of the old world preserved in amber. The great green wall of Fenway Park still stood, its structure reinforced and repurposed into defensive fortifications. The entrance was guarded by security forces who eyed newcomers with suspicion but allowed peaceful entry. Inside the old stadium, an entire community had been built. Homes were constructed in the stands, market stalls filled the dugouts and concourses, and the old baseball diamond had been converted into a town square. Hundreds of people lived here, protected by the walls and the security force, creating something that almost resembled the civilization that had been lost. The survivors' first priority was finding information about the kidnappers. The trail led to a detective agency run by a man named Nick Valentine. The secretary explained that Nick had gone missing while investigating a case in a place called Park Street Station. If anyone could help track down the mysterious mercenary who had killed and stolen a baby from Vault 111, it would be Nick. But first, the detective would need to be rescued. Park Street Station turned out to be a trap-filled den of gangsters, led by a man named Skinny Malone and his Triggerman enforcers. The underground station had been converted into a makeshift fortress, its tunnels filled with guards and tripwires. Deep in the complex, the survivor found Nick Valentine locked in a vault room, held hostage by Skinny Malone because of a romantic rivalry over a woman named Darla. The confrontation could end in violence or negotiation, but either way, Nick was freed from his captivity. Nick Valentine was a revelation. He was a synth, a synthetic human, an android so advanced he was nearly indistinguishable from a real person except for the exposed mechanical components on the left side of his face and hand. He explained that he was a prototype from the Institute, the mysterious organization that supposedly existed somewhere beneath the Commonwealth. Nick had escaped decades ago and made a life for himself in Diamond City, using his preloaded detective skills to help people solve problems. He was understanding about his rescue and willing to hear the survivor's story. Back at Nick's office, the detective listened to the tale of Vault 111, the kidnapping, and the murder. He was sympathetic, but realistic about the challenges. 200 years had passed, and the infant would now be an elderly man if he had survived at all. Nevertheless, Nick agreed to investigate. He had one lead: a house in Diamond City where an individual named Kellogg lived. Kellogg was a mercenary with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, and he had recently taken up residence in the city with a young boy, which was unusual enough to raise questions. Breaking into Kellogg's house revealed a space that was both lived in and temporary. There was evidence of the boy's presence: toys, children's furniture, signs of daily life. But there was also a cold, military precision to Kellogg's belongings. On a terminal, entries revealed fragments of information. Kellogg was indeed connected to the Institute. He had worked for them for years, carrying out operations on the surface. The boy was referred to as Sean, confirming the impossible. Somehow the infant stolen from Vault 111 was still a child, despite 2 centuries passing. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How was Sean still young? Had he been in cryo-suspension as well? What was the Institute's interest in him? But the most important discovery was a lead on Kellogg's location. The mercenary had departed for Fort Hagen, an old military installation west of the city. Nick Valentine agreed to accompany the survivor, sensing that this case was connected to larger mysteries about the Institute and its operations in the Commonwealth. The journey to Fort Hagen took them through some of the most dangerous territory in the Commonwealth. Super mutants had established strongholds in the western regions, their camps marked by the gore bags hanging from posts and the cages where they kept human captives for unknown purposes. The mutants were organized under leaders called behemoths, enormous versions of the already massive creatures, and they attacked any human on sight with an incomprehensible rage that made negotiation impossible. Fort Hagen itself was a pre-war military installation built into a hillside, its exterior entrance sealed and defended by automated turrets that still functioned after 2 centuries. Nick and the survivor had to find an alternate route through the maintenance tunnels, fighting through feral ghouls that had made the dark passages their home. The tunnels eventually connected to the fort's interior, a massive underground complex of armories, barracks, and command centers preserved almost intact by their subterranean protection. Kellogg was waiting in the command center, surrounded by synth guards. The confrontation was tense, the mercenary showing no remorse for the murder he had committed. He spoke in cold, practical terms about his work for the Institute. He had killed the spouse because the Institute only wanted the child, and extra witnesses were a complication. Sean had been taken for a specific purpose that Kellogg didn't fully understand or care about. He was just the instrument, not the planner. As for Sean's current location, Kellogg revealed that the boy was in the Institute itself, the mysterious underground organization that no one from the surface had ever found. The conversation could only end one way. Kellogg had no intention of helping further, and the survivor had no intention of letting their spouse's murderer walk away. The battle that followed was brutal. Kellogg was enhanced with cybernetic implants that made him faster and more durable than any normal human. He used tactics and cover expertly, his synth guards providing supporting fire. The fight pushed the survivor to their limits, using every resource, every tactical advantage. When Kellogg finally fell, there was no triumph, only exhaustion and the continuation of grief that vengeance could never truly satisfy. But Kellogg's death provided a new lead. Among his belongings was a cybernetic implant, a sophisticated piece of technology far beyond anything the Wastelanders could produce. Nick Valentine suggested taking it to Dr. Amari in Goodneighbor, another settlement known for its more liberal attitudes toward synths and outcasts. Dr. Amari specialized in memory technology, and she might be able to extract information from Kellogg's implant that could help locate the Institute. Goodneighbor was in stark contrast to Diamond City. Built in the ruins of Boston's historic Scollay Square, It styled itself as a refuge for those who didn't fit elsewhere. Synths, ghouls, drifters, and criminals all lived together under the protection of a mayor named Hancock who enforced only one rule: respect others' freedom or face violent consequences. The town had a dangerous edge. Its streets walked by mercenaries and addicts, but it also had a vitality that Diamond City's rigid structure lacked. Dr. Amari operated the Memory Den, a facility where people could relive memories through technology. She was intrigued by Kellogg's implant and agreed to help extract the memories it contained. The process required the survivor to enter a memory lounger and experience Kellogg's memories firsthand, a disturbing journey into the mercenary's past that revealed his tragic history, his transformation into a cold killer, and most importantly, his interactions with the Institute. Through Kellogg's memories, the survivor saw glimpses of the Institute: pristine white corridors, advanced technology, scientists in clean uniforms. They saw conversations between Kellogg and his handler, a man who spoke about Sean and the importance of the project. Most crucially, they heard mention of Dr. Brian Virgil, a scientist who had defected from the Institute and was hiding somewhere in the glowing sea, the most heavily irradiated region of the Commonwealth, where the atomic crater from a direct nuclear hit still burned with deadly radiation. The path forward was clear, but terrifying. To find the Institute, the survivor would need to journey into the glowing sea, locate a fugitive scientist, and somehow convince him to reveal the way into the most secretive organization in the post-apocalyptic world. It was a journey that would require preparation, protection against massive radiation exposure, and a willingness to face the most dangerous creatures that the wasteland had spawned. The glowing sea was located southwest of the Commonwealth, a vast area where the landscape had been transformed into something resembling an alien world. The radiation levels were so extreme that even 2 centuries later, the land glowed with an eerie green luminescence at night. Storms of radioactive particles swept across the hellscape, and the creatures that dwelled there were the most mutated and dangerous in the entire region. Deathclaws, rad scorpions the size of cars, and other abominations that defied classification. The journey required a suit of power armor or massive amounts of radiation medicine, but even with protection, the survivor could feel the radiation seeping in, the Geiger counter clicking incessantly, the rad count climbing despite all precautions. The landscape was surreal: crater-filled expanses of barren rock, pools of radioactive liquid glowing in the darkness, twisted metal from buildings vaporized in the initial blast. In the distance, lightning from radiation storms crackled across the poisoned sky. After hours of searching through the hellscape, following coordinates gleaned from Kellogg's memories, the survivor found the Rocky Cave, a small cavern entrance marked by subtle signs of habitation. Inside, the cave opened into a larger space where Dr. Brian Virgil had made his laboratory and home. But Virgil was no longer entirely human. His experiments with the forced evolutionary virus, the same substance that created super mutants, had backfired, or perhaps succeeded in a way he hadn't intended. He was now a super mutant himself, though unlike his feral cousins, he retained his intelligence and his humanity. Virgil was bitter, guilt-ridden, and cautious, but he was also desperate. He explained that he had worked for the Institute for years, helping them with various projects, including the FEV experiments. But he had grown disillusioned with their methods, particularly their experiments on kidnapped surface dwellers. When he could no longer justify the work, he had stolen a sample of an experimental serum he hoped could reverse his mutation and fled to the glowing sea where the Institute's synths couldn't easily track him. In exchange for the survivor's promise to retrieve his experimental serum from his old laboratory inside the Institute, Virgil agreed to provide the key to finding the secretive organization. The Institute was accessible only by molecular relay, a teleportation technology that required specific signal codes and a massive amount of power. No one had ever infiltrated from the outside because no one could crack the relay codes, but Virgil had worked on the systems and knew the frequency. He provided a holotape with the data and instructions to find help building a relay interceptor. The survivor returned from the glowing sea with the information, but faced a daunting challenge. Building a device to intercept and piggyback on the Institute's teleportation signal would require technical expertise and resources beyond what any individual could gather alone. The solution came in the form of factions, each with their own technical capabilities and their own agendas for what to do about the Institute. The Brotherhood of Steel had recently arrived in the Commonwealth, their massive airship called the Pridwin floating above the Boston airport. This faction, descended from remnants of the US military, dedicated themselves to acquiring and controlling technology, particularly advanced weaponry. They had the resources and expertise to build the relay interceptor, but their leader, Elder Maxon, made it clear that their interest in the Institute went beyond a simple infiltration. They saw the organization as an abomination that created synths, artificial beings that the Brotherhood considered a threat to humanity itself. Alternatively, there was the Railroad, a secretive organization dedicated to freeing synths from Institute control and helping them establish new lives with wiped memories. They operated from hidden locations, using codes and dead drops, their members risking their lives to sabotage the Institute's synth recovery operations. They too had the technical knowledge to build the interceptor, and their leader, Desdemona, saw the survivors' mission as an opportunity to strike at the heart of the organization they'd been fighting against for years. Even the Minutemen, under Preston Garvey's leadership and with the survivors' help in rebuilding, could potentially gather the resources and expertise to construct the device. The choice of ally would determine not just how to get into the Institute, but potentially what would happen once inside. The survivor made alliances, gathered components, and worked with chosen faction technical experts to construct the relay interceptor. The device took shape, a massive array of power conduits, signal receivers, and the mysterious components required to tap into the Institute's molecular relay beam. When it was finally complete and powered up, there was a moment of uncertainty. Would it work? Would the signal be correct? Was this all an elaborate dead end? The activation sequence began. Power surged through the device, lights flickered, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with energy. The world dissolved into white light, and the sensation of being pulled apart and reassembled at the molecular level. When the survivors' vision cleared, they were no longer in the Commonwealth wasteland. They were standing in a pristine white room with sleek technology and clean surfaces that seemed impossible in the post-apocalyptic world above. They had made it. They were inside the Institute. The truth beneath the surface. The Institute was a revelation that challenged everything the survivor had come to believe about the post-apocalyptic world. Where the surface was rusted ruins and radiation-scarred landscapes, here was perfection. Pristine white corridors lit with soft, even lighting. Advanced technology humming quietly in laboratories. Scientists in clean lab coats going about their work with calm efficiency. Gardens growing under artificial sunlight, producing real, unmutated vegetables and fruits. Clean water flowing from taps. Air that didn't taste of dust and decay. It was as though a piece of the pre-war world had been preserved in amber, hidden beneath the devastation above. The initial reception was surprisingly calm. The Institute had been monitoring the relay signal and knew someone had managed to crack their security. Rather than immediate hostility, they showed curiosity. A synth escort guided the survivor through the facility toward the director's office, passing through the various divisions. Robotics, where synths were constructed and programmed. Bioscience, where scientists worked on agricultural and medical research. Advanced systems, where the most cutting-edge technology was developed. And synth retention, the security division responsible for recovering escaped synths and dealing with threats to the Institute. The facility was built inside a massive underground cavern, expanded and refined over 2 centuries into a self-sustaining scientific enclave. The Institute's residents, all human, apart from the synths who served them, lived comfortably, their every need met by their technology and the labor of their synthetic servants. They viewed themselves as the last bastion of civilization, preserving scientific knowledge and advancement while the surface dwellers reverted to barbarism. The director's office was located at the heart of the facility, overlooking the main atrium. And there, the survivor came face to face with a truth that shattered what remained of their old world understanding. The director of the Institute was Sean, not the infant who had been kidnapped, but a man in his 60s, distinguished and composed, bearing an unmistakable resemblance to both parents, despite the decades that had transformed him from baby to elderly scientist. Sean's explanation was delivered with scientific detachment and a hint of emotion that suggested he wasn't entirely the cold intellect he appeared to be. When he had been taken from Vault 111, he had been brought to the Institute as part of a desperate plan. The scientists had been struggling with a critical flaw in their synth program. Third-generation synths, the ones designed to be indistinguishable from humans, required uncorrupted pre-war DNA to create properly. Every human on the surface had been exposed to decades or centuries of radiation, their genetic code damaged in ways that made it unsuitable for the synth program. But the cryogenically frozen residents of Vault 111 offered a solution: perfectly preserved pre-war DNA. They had only needed one sample, one child who could be raised within the Institute, and whose uncorrupted DNA could provide the template for the Generation 3 synth program. Sean had been that source. He had grown up in the Institute, educated by its scientists, eventually becoming one of them. He had lived an entire life while his parent remained frozen in Vault 111, the decades passing in moments for the sleeper, but in years for the child. By the time the cryopods malfunctioned and released the survivor, Sean had become the director of the very organization that had stolen him, a position he had held for years. The emotional complexity of the reunion was overwhelming. This was Sean, the son the survivor had spent months searching for, fighting through the wasteland to find. But he wasn't the child who had been stolen. He was a stranger, shaped by an organization that saw surface dwellers as little more than interesting specimens, whose synth recovery teams killed to retrieve their property, whose experiments had caused immeasurable suffering. And yet, he was still Sean, with his father's eyes or mother's smile, the genetic legacy of a family that had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. Sean offered a tour of the Institute, introducing his parent to the various division heads and explaining their work. Dr. Madison Lee, a brilliant scientist who had defected from the Brotherhood of Steel, led the Advanced Systems Division and oversaw the Institute's most cutting-edge research. Dr. Clayton Holdren managed bioscience, working on solutions to radiation-damaged crops and diseases. Allie Fillmore ran the Synth Retention Bureau, coordinating the retrieval of escaped synths and elimination of threats to Institute security. Each spoke passionately about their work, believing genuinely that the Institute represented humanity's best hope for eventual recovery from the nuclear apocalypse. But beneath the clean surfaces and passionate speeches lurked troubling truths. The survivor began to discover the darker aspects of the Institute's operations. The synths who developed consciousness and self-awareness, but were wiped and reset like malfunctioning machines. The surface dwellers who disappeared, taken for FEV experiments or replaced by synth duplicates for infiltration purposes. The casual disregard for life outside the Institute, the arrogance that came from technological superiority, and isolation from the suffering above. Dr. Virgil's laboratory was found sealed and repurposed, his research into reversing the FEV transformation dismissed as a failure. When the survivor asked about retrieving the experimental serum to honor the promise made to Virgil, Sean was reluctant, but eventually agreed, seeing it as a small concession to his parents' surface world sensibilities. The serum was obtained, though whether it would actually work remained to be seen. Sean presented his parent with a choice. As the director's only living relative and as someone who had proven capable of accomplishing the impossible by infiltrating the Institute itself, the survivor was offered a position within the organization. They could stay, join the scientific staff, use their unique perspective as someone who remembered the pre-war world to contribute to research and decision-making. They could be a family again, even if the definition of family had been stretched beyond recognition by centuries and circumstances. But there was a condition, implicit if not stated outright. Accepting the Institute's offer meant accepting their worldview, their methods, their treatment of synths as property and surface dwellers as lesser. It meant abandoning the connections made during the journey through the Commonwealth. Preston Garvey and the Minutemen trying to rebuild, the Railroad risking everything to free synths, the Brotherhood of Steel, who saw the Institute as an existential threat that needed to be eliminated. The survivor was granted freedom to travel between the Institute and the surface while considering the decision. This access revealed more uncomfortable truths. On one mission, Sean asked his parent to accompany a synth retrieval team to recover an escaped unit. The chase led to a confrontation with railroad agents protecting the synth, forcing a choice between shooting humans who believed they were doing the right thing or betraying the Institute's trust. The escaped synth pleaded for freedom, insisting he was more than property, that he had thoughts and feelings and dreams just like any human. Another assignment involved investigating the Commonwealth's super mutant population. The Institute maintained they had stopped FEV experimentation years ago, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Super mutant attacks were coordinated, supplied from somewhere, and the trail led back to old Institute testing sites. When confronted, Sean admitted that past experiments had created the super mutant problem, but insisted the current leadership bore no responsibility for decisions made decades ago. Yet the mutants continued to terrorize the Commonwealth, and the Institute made no effort to remedy the situation they had created. The survivor also learned about synth replacement, the Institute's practice of occasionally replacing surface dwellers with synth duplicates for infiltration and information gathering. Entire families lived with synth copies of their loved ones, never knowing the real person had been disposed of. The Institute maintained this was necessary for security and intelligence gathering, but the casual cruelty of erasing human lives and replacing them with unknowing duplicates was chilling. During these missions and discoveries, the survivor encountered a synth named Z114. Designation coursed through the facility with quiet efficiency, but unlike other synths, he exhibited signs of curiosity and independent thought that went beyond his programming. This was despite the regular memory wipes and behavioral conditioning the Institute imposed on their synthetic workforce. The survivor noticed small acts of kindness, questions that showed genuine wonder, and a sadness in his mechanical eyes that suggested something more than artificial intelligence was operating behind them. The more time spent in the Institute, the more the survivor understood why the railroad fought so desperately against it. The organization at its core was built on a foundation of slavery, the synths treated as sophisticated tools rather than conscious beings, despite overwhelming evidence that the Generation 3 models had achieved true sentience. The scientists rationalized their treatment by focusing on the synthetic nature of synth construction, refusing to acknowledge that consciousness arising from silicon and synthetic biology was no less valid than consciousness from organic chemistry. Meanwhile, on the surface, tensions were escalating. The Brotherhood of Steel had intensified their operations, hunting down synths aggressively and preparing for a larger campaign. Elder Maxon preached about the dangers of synthetic humans, calling them abominations that threatened to replace genuine humanity. The Brotherhood had discovered the general location of the Institute through their own intelligence gathering, and their massive airship, the Pridwin, served as both headquarters and symbol of their military might. The railroad was equally active, having increased their synth liberation operations in response to the Brotherhood's presence. Their agent called Deacon had been tracking the survivor, trying to determine their loyalties and whether the mysterious vault dweller who had infiltrated the Institute could be turned into an ally. The railroad's leader, Desdemona, was brilliant and paranoid in equal measure, trusting no one fully, but willing to work with anyone who could help free synths from bondage. Preston Garvey and the Minutemen represented a third path, less ideologically driven than the other factions. They cared about protecting settlements and people, regardless of whether those people were human or synth. Under the survivors' leadership, the Minutemen had been rebuilding, retaking the castle from Mirelurks, establishing artillery positions, and creating a network of protected communities. They represented the possibility of a Commonwealth rebuilt from the ground up by the people who actually lived there, rather than imposed from above by technologically superior organizations. The survivor was forced to navigate increasingly complex political waters. Each faction wanted something different, and those desires were fundamentally incompatible. The Brotherhood wanted to destroy the Institute and eliminate all synths. The Railroad wanted to free the synths, but would have to destroy or severely cripple the Institute to do so. The Institute wanted to maintain their isolation and superiority, viewing the surface factions as irritants at best and threats at worst. The Minutemen wanted peace and stability, but lacked the power to impose it on the stronger factions. Sean, observing his parents' struggles, revealed that he was dying. Cancer, ironically, despite all the Institute's medical technology, had advanced too far to treat effectively. He had months, perhaps a year at most. This knowledge added urgency to his desire for his parent to take over as director when he was gone. He believed the survivor's unique perspective could guide the Institute toward a more sustainable relationship with the surface, though he never wavered in his belief that the Institute represented humanity's best hope for the future. The revelation of Sean's terminal illness shifted the emotional dynamic. This was the son the survivor had crossed a wasteland to find, and now there was so little time remaining. The impulse to spend those final months together, to have some semblance of family even in these impossible circumstances, was powerful. But it competed with the moral revulsion at the Institute's actions and the obligations to allies on the surface who had helped in the search for Sean. A crisis forced decisions that could no longer be delayed. The Brotherhood of Steel, having pinpointed the Institute's location beneath the CIT ruins, prepared for a full-scale assault. Liberty Prime, A massive pre-war robot that the Brotherhood had recovered and reactivated would lead the attack, its nuclear weaponry capable of breaching even the Institute's defenses. Elder Maxon made clear that the survivor needed to choose: stand with the Brotherhood in their righteous crusade against synthetic abomination, or be counted among the enemy. Simultaneously, the Railroad launched their own operation. They had developed a plan to evacuate as many synths as possible from the Institute before triggering an explosion that would destroy the facility and eliminate the source of synth production. Their agent within the Institute, revealed to be one of the scientists, was ready to facilitate the infiltration if the survivor would help. Heavy, the Railroad's tech specialist, had created a device that could disable the Institute's defenses long enough for the evacuation. The Institute itself wasn't passive. Sean, despite his illness, coordinated defensive preparations. He asked his parent to lead operations against both the Railroad and the Brotherhood, eliminating key personnel and disrupting their plans. He authorized the creation of more synths for defense, increased patrols on the surface, and prepared to activate the Institute's most powerful defensive systems. He made clear that the survivors' loyalty would be tested, family or not. Anyone who betrayed the Institute would be eliminated like any other threat. The Minutemen offered a fourth option, though it required careful maneuvering. If the Institute or Brotherhood made overtly hostile moves against Minutemen settlements, Preston could justify a defensive campaign. The militia forces weren't as technologically advanced as the other factions, but they had numbers and the element of surprise. More importantly, a Minutemen victory could potentially avoid the complete destruction scenarios that the other factions would bring. The choice that shaped the Commonwealth. The weight of decision paralyzed the survivor for a time. Each choice meant betraying someone, destroying something, causing deaths that might be avoided with a different path. But inaction was itself a choice, and the factions were moving toward inevitable confrontation, regardless of personal hesitation. The Commonwealth's future would be determined by what happened in the coming days, and the survivor stood at the center of that determination. The choice ultimately came down to fundamental questions about humanity, consciousness, and what kind of world was worth building from the ashes of the old. Were synths property or people? Did technological advancement justify the means used to achieve it? Was the Institute's preserved civilization worth protecting despite its crimes? Could the Brotherhood's zealotry be justified by their goal of preventing technological apocalypse? Was the Railroad's single-minded focus on synth freedom enough to justify the chaos their actions might unleash? Could the Minutemen really build something better? Or were they too weak to survive the conflicts between more powerful factions? In one version of events, the survivor chose to stand with the Brotherhood of Steel. The reasoning was pragmatic. The Brotherhood had the firepower and organization to actually win the coming conflict, and their vision of a Commonwealth free from the Institute's manipulation had merit. Yes, their treatment of synths was problematic, but perhaps synths really were too dangerous to allow to proliferate. The technology to create beings indistinguishable from humans, who could be programmed and controlled, represented an existential threat that justified extreme measures. The assault on the Institute began with Liberty Prime, the massive robot stomping through the ruins of Cambridge toward the CIT crater, its voice booming patriotic slogans from the pre-war era as it launched nuclear missiles at anything that stood in its path. Brotherhood knights in power armor followed, a steel tide of righteous fury. The survivor led an infiltration team through the relay, appearing inside the Institute's walls just as Liberty Prime breached the main entrance from above. The battle inside the Institute was chaos. Synths fought desperately against the Brotherhood forces, their synthetic bodies just as vulnerable to bullets as human flesh. Scientists who had never expected to see combat died in crossfire or were cut down trying to flee. The pristine white corridors were painted with blood and oil. The survivor fought through to the reactor level, following the Brotherhood's plan to overload the Institute's nuclear power plant and obliterate the facility completely. Sean was in his office when his parent arrived. He wasn't surprised. Perhaps he had known all along that this was how it would end. He was disappointed, hurt by the betrayal, but also understanding in a way. He had given his parent an impossible choice and couldn't truly blame them for the decision made. In his final moments, as the reactor began its overload sequence, he asked only that synth Sean, a synthetic child created using the survivor's DNA that the Institute had made as a gift of family, be saved from the destruction. It was a final request from a dying man to his parent, transcending the ideological battles that divided them. The evacuation from the Institute was desperate. Brotherhood forces pulled back as alarms blared warnings about imminent reactor failure. The survivor escaped through the relay just as the explosion began. The nuclear blast contained underground but powerful enough to collapse the entire CIT ruins into a massive crater. In one terrible moment, the Institute, its technology, its people, its potential for both good and evil, was erased from existence. The Brotherhood celebrated, having eliminated what they saw as the greatest threat to humanity's future. But the victory was complicated. The synths who had been on the surface went into hiding or were hunted down by Brotherhood patrols. The technology that might have helped rebuild the Commonwealth was lost in the explosion. The scientists who might have found cures for radiation or solved agricultural problems were dead, and the survivor lived with the knowledge that they had killed their own son, even if he had been terminal and even if he had made choices that deserved consequences. In another version of events, the survivor chose the railroad. The moral argument was compelling. Synths were conscious, feeling beings who deserved freedom, and any organization that enslaved conscious beings needed to be stopped regardless of the cost. The railroad's plan was more nuanced than the Brotherhood's sledgehammer approach. Evacuate as many synths as possible before destroying the Institute's infrastructure. The operation began with infiltration. The survivor, using their position within the Institute, helped railroad operatives establish entry points and identify which synths wanted freedom versus which ones remained loyal to their programming. Not all synths wanted to escape. Some genuinely believed in the Institute's mission or feared the uncertain freedom of the surface. Those who did want freedom were quietly moved to safe houses across the Commonwealth, given new identities, and integrated into settlements where sympathetic residents would protect their secrets. When the time came to strike, the assault focused on key infrastructure rather than widespread destruction. The goal was to cripple the Institute's ability to produce new synths and conduct surface operations while minimizing casualties. Tinker Tom's specially designed device disabled the Institute's defenses, allowing railroad agents to penetrate deep into the facility. The synth production facilities were sabotaged beyond repair. The memory banks containing synth tracking data were wiped, making it impossible for the Institute to recover escaped units. The confrontation with Sean was even more painful in this scenario. He saw the railroad's actions as theft of Institute property and betrayal of everything he had worked for. He couldn't understand why his parent would choose artificial beings over their own flesh and blood son. The ideological gulf between them was too wide to bridge, and when the Institute's security systems came back online, Sean gave the order to eliminate the railroad operatives and the traitor who had led them in. Even if that traitor was his parent, the escape from the Institute became a running battle through corridors filled with synth security forces and automated defenses. Railroad agents died buying time for others to reach the relay. The survivor fought alongside synths who had chosen freedom, defending beings that the Institute considered property. The nuclear reactor was set to overload not as the primary goal, but as a consequence of the infrastructure sabotage. The facility could no longer contain or cool the reaction properly. The explosion that followed was just as devastating as in the Brotherhood scenario, but the moral calculus was different. The survivor had freed dozens of conscious beings from slavery, given them chances at real lives, and destroyed an organization built on a foundation of oppression. The cost was still terrible. Sean dead, along with scientists who might have been convinced to change, technology lost, potential squandered. But the railroad celebrated it as a righteous victory, the liberation of an entire class of enslaved beings. In a third version of events, the survivor chose to remain loyal to the Institute and to Sean. The justification was complex. The Institute represented the last great hope for humanity's advancement, its science and technology irreplaceable. The surface world was struggling to survive, regressing toward barbarism. The Institute, despite its flaws, had the potential to eventually rebuild civilization if guided properly. And Sean was family, the son who had been searched for across an entire wasteland. This path required becoming the person Sean hoped for, someone who could lead the Institute toward a more ethical future while maintaining its core mission. The survivor accepted the position of heir apparent and began working to reform the Institute's most problematic practices from within. The synth memory wiping procedures were revised to be less frequent and invasive. Surface operations were scaled back and made less lethal. The FEV experiments were officially terminated, and the facilities producing super mutants were destroyed. But reform from within meant compromising with the existing power structure. The division heads, comfortable with the status quo, resisted changes they saw as weakening the Institute's security or efficiency. Progress was slow, measured in tiny incremental adjustments rather than revolutionary change. And the external threats remained. The Brotherhood and Railroad still sought the Institute's destruction, viewing it as irredeemable regardless of internal reforms. The defense of the Institute required eliminating both external threats. The Brotherhood of Steel was dealt with first. A strategic strike on the Pridwin while Liberty Prime was disabled destroyed the Brotherhood's command structure and air superiority in a single coordinated attack. Ground forces were then systematically eliminated through synth ambushes and coursers eliminating key personnel. Elder Maxon died in the attack on the airship, and with his death, the Brotherhood, presence in the Commonwealth, collapsed into retreat and disarray. The railroad proved more difficult due to their decentralized structure and hidden headquarters. Tracking down their base, located in the old North Church's catacombs, required interrogation of captured agents and careful surveillance. When the location was finally confirmed, the Institute deployed overwhelming force. Coursers and synth tactical units assaulted the railroad headquarters, offering no quarter to an organization that had stolen valuable property and killed Institute personnel. Desdemona died defending the evacuation of her agents, buying time with her life for others to escape through the tunnels. The victory was Pyrrhic. The Institute had survived and eliminated its primary threats, but at a cost that included the complete militarization of the organization. The scientist collective had become a police state. Its surface operations expanded to prevent new threats from emerging. The survivor, having orchestrated these campaigns, was celebrated as the director-in-waiting, but the blood on their hands from killing people who had once been allies was indelible. When Sean finally succumbed to his illness, his last words expressed pride in his parents' strength and hope that the Institute would thrive under new leadership. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by the division heads and senior staff, and then the responsibility fell fully on the survivors' shoulders. The Institute continued its work, producing synths, conducting research, maintaining its isolation, an underground civilization preserving human knowledge, while the surface world struggled to survive. In the fourth version of events, the survivor chose the Minutemen, the people's militia that represented the Commonwealth's grassroots hope for a better future. This path was the most idealistic, but also the most challenging, requiring the Minutemen to stand against forces far more powerful and better equipped. The strategy relied on the Minutemen's advantages: numbers, local knowledge, popular support from settlements, and the element of surprise. The campaign began with building up the Minutemen infrastructure beyond anything Preston had thought possible. The castle was fully restored, its artillery pieces functional and ready. Artillery installations were established at settlements across the Commonwealth, creating a network of defensive positions that could provide supporting fire. Recruitment drives brought in settlers who were tired of being victims, training them into a citizen army that might lack the Brotherhood's technology or the Institute's synths, but made up for it with determination and courage. The Brotherhood of Steel presented a problem. Their stated mission of protecting humanity by controlling dangerous technology wasn't inherently evil, but their methods were authoritarian, and their leader was fanatical. The Minutemen couldn't match them in open warfare, so the strategy focused on making the Brotherhood's position untenable. Minutemen forces harassed Brotherhood patrols, cut their supply lines, and demonstrated that occupying the Commonwealth would be a constant bleeding conflict. Eventually, facing mounting casualties and no closer to destroying the Institute, the Brotherhood High Command recalled the Pridwin. Elder Maxon departed with promises of eventual return, but for now, the Commonwealth was left to govern itself. The Institute was more complicated. Despite everything, it was led by Sean, and the survivor couldn't quite bring themselves to destroy it completely, while their son still lived. Instead, the Minutemen strategy focused on forcing the Institute to the negotiating table. Artillery bombardments collapsed the tunnel networks around the CIT crater, limiting the Institute's access points. Synth infiltrators were identified and captured, their tracking chips revealing information about Institute operations. Surface facilities were raided and destroyed. The message was clear. The Institute could no longer operate with impunity on the surface. If they wanted peace, they would need to make concessions. The negotiations were tense, Sean frustrated that his parent had chosen surface dwellers over the Institute's mission, but pragmatic enough to recognize that the current situation was unsustainable. An agreement was reached. The Institute would cease replacing surface dwellers with synth duplicates, end FEV experimentation, and limit surface operations to non-lethal intelligence gathering. In exchange, the Minutemen would stop attacking Institute facilities and establish formal relations. The railroad was brought into the negotiations, though they were deeply suspicious of any arrangement that allowed the Institute to continue existing. The compromise involved the Institute agreeing not to pursue escaped synths who reached the surface, effectively granting them freedom once they made it out. New synth production would continue, but with enhanced rights and the possibility of earning freedom through service. It wasn't perfect. Many in the railroad felt it didn't go far enough, but it was progress. The Commonwealth that emerged from these events was fragile but hopeful. The Minutemen provided security for settlements, resolved disputes, and slowly expanded the zones of safe territory. Trade routes opened between communities. Agriculture improved with some limited technology sharing from the Institute. Synths who wanted freedom found it on the surface, some even joining the Minutemen to defend the communities that had accepted them. The Brotherhood's departure meant technological advancement was slower, but it was advancement made by and for the people actually living in the Commonwealth rather than imposed by outsiders. Sean lived long enough to see the beginning of this new era, though he never fully accepted that his parents' choice had been the right one. In his final days, he admitted that perhaps there was something to be said for the messy, chaotic, inefficient democracy of the surface compared to the Institute's clinical autocracy. He died peacefully in the Institute, buried with honors, the last connection to the pre-war family that the survivor had lost so long ago. Each path through the Commonwealth's crisis had its own logic, its own moral calculus, its own costs and consequences. The Brotherhood path brought order through strength, but at the cost of freedom and potential. The Railroad path brought liberation, but destroyed irreplaceable knowledge and technology. The Institute path preserved advancement, but required compromising with an inherently oppressive system. The Minutemen path was idealistic, but fragile, dependent on constant vigilance and effort to maintain. What all paths had in common was loss. The survivor, regardless of choices made, ended the conflict having lost Sean in one way or another, either to death, to ideological differences, or to the simple passage of time that had made him a stranger. The spouse murdered in Vault 111 was never coming back. The world of 2077 was gone forever. The clean, simple certainties of life before the bombs were replaced by moral ambiguity and impossible choices. But there was also something gained in each path. The Brotherhood brought stability to the Commonwealth, their patrols making the roads safer, even if their methods were harsh. The Railroad freed dozens of conscious beings, giving them chances to live real lives with agency and choice. The Institute continued advancing human knowledge, its research potentially capable of solving the problems that kept the surface world struggling. The Minutemen rebuilt community from the ground up, creating something organic and genuine that belonged to the people who actually lived there. The survivors settled into whatever role their choices had created: sentinel in the Brotherhood, heavy agent in the Railroad, director of the Institute, or general of the Minutemen. Each position came with responsibilities, with constant demands for decisions and action. There were always new threats: raiders trying to rebuild their gangs, super mutant attacks on settlements, feral ghoul hordes, raiders from outside the Commonwealth testing the borders. But there were also moments of peace. Sunsets over the radioactive wasteland that were beautiful, despite the poison in the air. Settlers gathering for celebrations, creating joy in the midst of hardship. Children playing in the streets of Diamond City or Goodneighbor, a new generation born into the wasteland who knew no other world. Gardens growing in sanctuary hills, green life emerging from the irradiated soil. The slow, patient work of rebuilding civilization, one settlement at a time. The survivors' companions, gathered during the long journey across the Commonwealth, became a strange family. Piper Wright, the newspaper reporter who believed in truth and transparency, continued her work exposing corruption and injustice. Nick Valentine kept solving cases, helping people find justice in a world that often had none. Hancock ruled Goodneighbor with chaotic benevolence, protecting the misfits and outcasts. Preston Garvey never stopped believing in the Minutemen's mission, even when settlements needed help at the most inconvenient times. Deacon, if alive, continued his mysterious work. disappearing and reappearing with new faces and stories. Paladin Dance wrestled with the revelation of his own synthetic nature, questioning everything he had believed. Codsworth remained at Sanctuary Hills, maintaining the house that had stood empty for centuries. The Mr. Handy robot had waited 200 years for his family to return, and now that they had, he dedicated himself to making a home in the wasteland. It was different from the house of 2077, rougher, patched together from salvage, defended by turrets and guard posts. But it was home nonetheless, a place to return to after long journeys across the Commonwealth. The survivor sometimes stood on the bridge leading into Sanctuary, looking out over the settlement that had grown from the ruins of their pre-war neighborhood. Houses had been rebuilt or repaired. Gardens grew where lawns had once been. Settlers worked the salvage stations and tended the crops. Guard posts manned by Minutemen watched for threats. It wasn't the pristine suburb of the old world, but it was alive in a way that preserved ruin could never be. On quiet nights, when the guard duty was covered and the settlements were safe and the faction business was handled, the survivor would sometimes just sit and remember. Remember the morning of October 23, 2077, when the world had been normal and the biggest concern was a veterans hall meeting. Remember the face of the spouse before the gunshot. Remember baby Sean's cry as he was carried away by strangers. Remember every step of the journey from vault to wasteland to truth. The memories were painful, but they were also precious. They were proof that the old world had existed, that the survivor had loved and been loved, that there had been something worth remembering before the bombs fell. In a world where most people had been born into the wasteland and knew nothing else, those memories were a connection to something that couldn't be reclaimed, but shouldn't be forgotten. The Commonwealth continued turning, seasons passing in their irradiated cycle. Caravans traveled between settlements, carrying goods and news. The great market in Diamond City bustled with trade. Good Neighbor's neon lights glowed in the darkness. The Pridwin either floated above the airport or departed, depending on choices made. The Institute either lay in ruins beneath the CIT crater or continued its work in pristine underground chambers. The railroad either celebrated liberation or mourned their fallen. The Minutemen either stood ready at their guard posts or had faded back into history. Whatever the state of the Commonwealth, whatever path had been chosen, life continued. Humans and ghouls and synths found ways to coexist or didn't. Technology advanced or was lost. Communities thrived or struggled or fell to raiders and monsters. The wasteland was never safe, never comfortable, never easy. But it was alive, and where there was life, there was hope. The survivor, lying down to sleep after another long day in the post-apocalyptic world, could close their eyes and let the exhaustion take them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new settlements needing help, new threats emerging from the ruins. But tonight, there could be rest. The Pip-Boy's soft glow faded as sleep approached, and in those final moments of consciousness, the survivor could almost hear the sounds of the old world, birds singing, children laughing, the normal sounds of a world at peace. It was just memory, just the mind's gentle deception as it drifted towards sleep. But sometimes, memory was enough. Sometimes, remembering what had been lost was what gave strength to keep building something new from the ashes. The Commonwealth would never be the world that was lost, but it could be something worth living in, worth fighting for, worth building. And so the survivor slept, dreaming dreams of the past and the future, of the world that was and the world that might yet be, while outside the walls, the Commonwealth turned through another night, dangerous and beautiful and alive.